Imagine boarding a first-class flight expecting a peaceful trip, only to be embarrassed by the very crew meant to take care of you. Walter Bennett, a proud and respectful elderly man, stepped onto that plane with nothing but excitement in his heart. He was there to surprise his son, the pilot. But by the time they landed, what should have been a happy moment turned into a shocking event that would shake the entire airline. You won't believe how his son reacted when he learned what happened high above the ground at 30,000 feet. Walter Bennett had traveled across the world, experienced its beauty, and faced its tough moments. Now retired, and in his late 70s, he still carried himself with calm confidence. People naturally took notice of him. Today was special. He had planned a surprise for his son Jackson, the pilot he was incredibly proud of. Jackson had worked hard for years to become a pilot, a dream that started when he watched planes take off from their small hometown airport in Louisiana. This trip meant a lot to Walter. He had bought a first-class ticket on one of Jackson's flights, hoping to quietly watch his son in action and surprise him after they landed. Walter dressed sharply in a dark blue suit. His hands shook a little with age, but his eyes were bright and full of excitement as he waited to board at Denver International Airport. The gate area was busy, filled with people rushing by, hardly noticing the elderly man quietly checking in his ticket. The flight attendants welcomed him with polite smiles as he passed, and soon he was sitting comfortably in his first-class seat. Walter looked around, amazed by the luxury, the soft leather seats, cozy blankets, and gentle music playing in the background. He could feel Jackson's success all around him, and his heart filled with pride. But Walter wasn't looking for special treatment, even in first class. He just wanted to enjoy a simple trip and maybe get a small look into the life his son now lived. Not long after settling in, a young flight attendant with a neat uniform walked up to him. Her name tag read Lizzie, and she smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, sir," she said kindly. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" "A little water, if you don't mind," he answered, nodding with thanks. As Lizzie went to get the water, another flight attendant walked by. This one was different. His name was Tom, a tall, broad man with a stiff look on his face and eyes that made Walter feel like he didn't belong there. As Walter adjusted in his seat, Tom's stare stayed on him, his face showing quiet disapproval. A few moments later, Lizzie came back with the water. Walter took slow sips, but he couldn't shake the strange feeling in the air as Tom's eyes stayed fixed on him from across the cabin. Walter pushed the thought aside, deciding to focus on the joy of the trip instead. As the plane moved along the runway, Walter leaned back, looking out the window with a soft smile. The steady sound of the engines calmed him, and soon he was lost in thought, proud of how far Jackson had come. He imagined the moment they would share after landing, a surprise for both of them. Walter closed his eyes for a short while, letting the excitement settle in. But his peace didn't last long. Tom appeared again, walking through the aisle and checking on the passengers. Walter noticed that every other first-class traveler received warm smiles and friendly attention. But when Tom passed Walter's seat, his face turned cold. He didn't even look at him and walked by quickly. Walter let it go, hoping it was just a mistake. A few minutes later, another flight attendant approached. She was blonde and polite, but carried a forced kindness. Her name tag said Katie. She was offering snacks to everyone, moving seat by seat. When she reached Walter, her hand stopped halfway, as if she was having second thoughts. "Would you like a snack, sir?" she asked, in a polite but tense voice. Then she quickly added, "We have a few choices, but I'm not sure they'll suit your taste." Walter caught her quick glance and the small smirk she tried to hide. For the first time, he felt uneasy. The message was quiet, but it was clear. He didn't answer right away. He noticed her attitude, but finally he gently replied, "I'll take whatever you have," he answered calmly, keeping his voice steady. Katie handed him a small snack, but Walter noticed her rolling her eyes as she walked away. He could feel the looks from nearby passengers who had witnessed the moment. Still, Walter sat back, hoping it was all just a misunderstanding, or maybe the crew was simply having a bad day. As the flight went on, small but clear moments began to build up. When Walter asked Katie for a blanket, she paused and quickly glanced at Tom. Tom gave her a small nod, almost like he was silently giving her permission to help. It was a small thing, but each moment felt like a little jab, making Walter feel more and more out of place. Walter thought about saying something, but something inside him told him to wait. Later, as Katie prepared to serve the meals, she glanced at Walter again. This time, her eyes showed fake sympathy. "You might want to be careful with the lunch trays," she said, her voice light, but her smirk barely hidden. "Wouldn't want to mess up that nice suit." Walter's jaw tightened a little, but he kept his cool. He had always believed in staying calm, treating people with kindness, and letting small things go, but this felt different. The way they looked at him, the small but clear signs, the words that didn't sound honest, it was more than just poor service. It felt personal. Walter wondered if it was because of his appearance, his age, or something else. He turned to look out the window, trying to take his mind off the growing discomfort. The excitement he'd felt earlier was now slowly being replaced by unease. He silently hoped the meal service would pass without any more trouble, and found comfort in thinking about seeing Jackson soon. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the soft sounds of clinking glasses and quiet conversations filled the cabin. Walter took a deep breath, trying to settle his nerves, focusing on the steady hum of the flight. His thoughts kept going back to Jackson, imagining the pride he'd feel seeing his son in his pilot's uniform. Walter reminded himself that this journey wasn't just about this flight. There was a special reunion waiting. Not long after, Katie and Tom began moving the meal cart through the aisle. Walter noticed how carefully they served each passenger in front of him. Meals were handed over smoothly, and every guest was greeted with polite words and attention. The delicious smell of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and warm soup filled the cabin. But when Katie finally reached Walter, her behavior changed. Her fake smile returned, her lips pressed tight in a way that looked more like a sneer. "Here you go, sir," she said, holding the tray awkwardly high over his head, making it hard for him to reach. Before Walter could adjust his hands to take the tray, Katie suddenly twisted her wrist sharply. The whole meal tipped forward, and a hot dish of pasta and sauce spilled onto Walter's head, sliding down his shoulders. "Oh dear!" Katie gasped, but there was no real shock in her voice. Instead, she allowed a small smile to appear, no longer bothering to hide it. "I'm so sorry, sir. Looks like I'm a little clumsy today." Walter sat still, feeling the warm food soak into his shirt and drip down his collar, sticking uncomfortably to his skin. The sauce left a large stain on the lapel of his suit. He was speechless, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had spent his life teaching young people about staying strong in the face of challenges, but this moment tested him deeply. The insult hurt more than the messy clothes. "Could you bring me a napkin?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, meeting Katie's eyes directly. Katie's fake smile didn't fade. "Unfortunately, we seem to be out," she said, pretending to be sorry, then turned back to the cart and moved on without another word. Walter quietly reached for his own handkerchief, cleaning himself as best he could. He noticed nearby passengers watching him, some with pity, some looking uncomfortable, A few whispered to each other, but no one spoke up. From the far end of the aisle, Tom stood with his arms crossed, watching, his face hard and unreadable. Walter swallowed, his throat tight, but he kept his head high. He reminded himself that he was here for Jackson, that seeing his son was worth every uncomfortable moment. Still, deep inside, a slow anger began to rise, mixed with the sting of humiliation. The rest of the meal service went on without more problems, but the damage was already done. The once warm and welcoming cabin now felt cold and heavy. Every moment now seemed filled with quiet hostility. Walter sat in silence, carefully wiping away the last bits of sauce from his collar, trying to stay calm and patient. He made up his mind to keep quiet, at least until the flight was over. Walter had faced worse in life, and he knew there was no point in making things worse while still in the air. He kept his eyes fixed on the sky beyond the small window, reminding himself that this ordeal would soon be over. He told himself that seeing Jackson would make all of this fade into the past, just another story to forget. After what felt like forever, the captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing that they were starting their descent. Walter took a deep breath, feeling both relieved and exhausted. The thought of seeing Jackson kept him steady, a small light in the middle of an unpleasant journey. He carefully adjusted his stained suit, reminding himself that the sight of his son would be worth it, no matter what had happened. When the plane finally landed and rolled to the gate, a wave of relief washed over him. He stayed seated as the other first-class passengers gathered their things and left. Walter quietly watched as Katie and Tom shared knowing looks, their bodies relaxed, almost as if they were proud of how the flight had gone. When the cabin was nearly empty, Walter slowly stood up, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He grabbed his small bag and calmly walked toward the exit, determined not to let them see any hint of sadness or defeat. But just as he reached the door, a familiar voice broke through the silence. "Dad?" Walter turned and saw Jackson standing there, dressed in his pilot's uniform, his face lighting up with a mix of joy and surprise. But the smile quickly disappeared when Jackson noticed the stains on his father's suit and the tired look in his eyes. "Dad, what happened?" Jackson asked, his voice low but tight, his eyes quickly scanning the cabin. Before Walter could speak, Tom appeared behind Jackson, clearly caught off guard. His face lost all color when he realized that the man he had mistreated was the pilot's father. Katie froze in place, her fake smile slipping as she realized the truth. Jackson's gaze moved between his father and the two flight attendants. His face hardened as he quickly understood what had happened. "Did you two treat my father like this?" His voice was cold, full of disbelief and quiet anger. Katie stumbled over her words, her cheeks turning red. We didn't know he was your father. It was an accident, sir." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "An accident?" he repeated, his voice sharp and controlled. "Accidents happen, but the way you're looking right now doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like you knew exactly what you were doing." He stepped closer, standing tall, his tone firm. "I trusted this airline to treat every passenger with respect, but you treated my father like he didn't matter. If you can do this to him, I can't imagine how you treat others." Walter, who had stayed silent, gently placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder, trying to calm him. "Son, it's all right," he said, softly, though his eyes showed how tired he was. "I'm here now. That's what matters." But Jackson shook his head firmly. "No, Dad, it's not all right. This kind of behavior is never okay, no matter who it happens to." He turned back to Katie and Tom, his voice steady and serious. "I'll be speaking with management. This will be fully reported. Both of you will be held responsible." Katie looked like she wanted to argue, but one sharp look from Jackson made her close her mouth. She lowered her head, clearly ashamed. Tom still tried to keep his tough look, but his confidence was fading. Jackson then turned to Walter, his voice softening. "Come on, Dad, let's get you cleaned up." As they walked through the airport, Walter felt a deep warmth inside, not just pride in his son, but real gratitude for Jackson's loyalty and strength. This wasn't just about a bad flight. It was about respect, about standing up for what's right, about treating everyone with fairness, no matter who they are or where they come from. They reached the airline office where Jackson carefully explained everything to the managers. Walter sat quietly, watching his son speak up with professionalism and calm strength. It was a powerful moment that showed Jackson's true character, a reflection of the values Walter had taught him all his life. After reporting the incident, Jackson stayed by his father's side as the airline staff began reviewing the situation. Walter quietly watched as Jackson's firm, steady approach made it clear that this wasn't just a small complaint. It was about accountability. The managers, looking uncomfortable, listened closely as Jackson calmly explained what had happened. His voice was steady but carried a weight that no one could ignore. The senior airline supervisor, Mr. Harlan, a serious-looking man with greying hair, carefully took notes, clearly realizing the importance of what had just been shared. "I sincerely apologize, Mr. Bennett, for what you went through on your flight," Mr. Harlan said, his voice firm but regretful. "This kind of treatment is completely unacceptable under any circumstances." "Apologies are fine," Jackson replied calmly, his tone steady. "But what really matters is action. No passenger should ever feel disrespected, especially by people whose job is to ensure their comfort and safety. This is about basic human decency." Mr. Harlan cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "You have my word, Captain Bennett. This will be handled properly. I'll personally make sure that both Katie and Tom are suspended immediately while we conduct a full investigation. They will also face disciplinary action, which may include retraining or even termination, depending on what we find." Walter, sitting quietly beside his son, gave a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice steady but worn. "I appreciate you taking this seriously." Mr. Harlan let out a slow breath and gave a small, regretful smile. "Mr. Bennett, I want you to know we hold our employees to the highest standards. Your experience has shown us that we need to make those standards even stronger." When the meeting ended, Jackson and Walter finally left the office. As they walked through the airport, Jackson glanced at his father. "Dad, I'm really sorry this happened. I thought the values I brought to this airline would show in every flight, in every crew member." Walter placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't need to apologize, son. This isn't your fault. What matters is that you were there. You stood up for what's right." Jackson's face softened. "You always taught me that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." He paused, then added, "I just hope that by speaking up, we've made it a little better for the next person." As they left the terminal, the weight of the days slowly lifted. They shared a quiet moment, both realizing that in a strange way, this painful experience had brought them closer. They walked out of the airport grateful for each other, hopeful that the small change they had started would spread. A few weeks later, life had gone back to its normal pace, but the memory of that flight stayed with both Walter and Jackson. It became part of their story, a reminder of the work still needed in the world. For Walter, it was a sharp lesson about how bias can show up even in places that should be neutral, like an airplane cabin. He often thought back on the flight not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of purpose. Even at his age, Walter still believed change was possible. And he knew his son's courage that day had been the start of something bigger. One morning, Walter received a letter from the airliner. Inside was a handwritten note from Mr. Harlan. The letter offered a heartfelt apology, but more importantly, it explained what the airline was doing to fix the problem. They were starting new training programs focused on respect, kindness, and recognizing bias. Training that would now be mandatory for every flight attendant and staff member. Mr. Harlan also shared that both Tom and Katie had been suspended while the review continued, and that stronger steps were being put in place to prevent such behavior in the future. As Walter read the letter, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just empty words, it was action. When Jackson visited later that afternoon, Walter handed him the letter. As Jackson read it, his face softened with pride and quiet relief. "Dad, this means a lot," Jackson said, his voice low. "It's a start. It's the first step toward making sure everyone is treated with respect." Walter nodded. "You know, I was angry that day, not just at them, but at the idea that they thought they could get away with it. But what you did, the way you stood up, reminded me that things can change, one step at a time." Jackson met his father's gaze, a quiet fire in his eyes. "And we will, Dad. We'll keep pushing for it." They sat together, in a peaceful silence, a shared promise between them, a hope for a world where dignity and respect weren't rare, but expected. As they looked out the window toward the sky, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Real hope. Hope that despite everything, the world could still change, and that people like Jackson would help make it happen.